years, from like 1935 to now, for people to go, wow, maybe cows aren't supposed to eat corn or soy, or chickens aren't supposed to eat corn or soy. So the pasturing process, it concentrates these fat-soluble activators in the fatty tissue of the animals, so eggs, organ meats, lard, tallow, fish eggs, shellfish. All the fatty parts of these animals are very highly concentrated with these vitamins. Okay, so what else did he find? He found that these diets were incredibly varied across the globe. As you can imagine, I mean, people in Alaska were eating seal and whale meat and fish eggs, and people in Switzerland, in the Laurentian Valley, in this very remote village, were eating rye bread and raw dairy products, cultured dairy products. They would have bone broth. Basically what he found is that although the diets were varied across the globe, they all had about 6 principles in common. The first one, which is what we're going to talk about today, is fermentation. So all of the cultures that he studied around the globe fermented some portion of their food, both animal and vegetable. So why did they do that? Well, on the face of it, they did it because they didn't have refrigeration. And without refrigeration, things spoil. Okay, so they were taking advantage of the natural bacteria that exist on all living organisms, which is the lactobacillus bacteria, and they were exponentially multiplying it through this process of culturing or fermenting their food. And in so doing, they were increasing the vitamin content, the enzyme content, and they were protecting the food from putrefaction. So pathogenic bacteria could not get a foothold as long as these lactobacteria had gained and established a colony in that food source. So that was the first thing that he found. The second thing he found, we'll just run through these because we're not going to study all these today, but bone broth. Every culture that he studied around the globe made bone broth for minerals and for gelatin. And bone broth has, what does it have in it?
Marrow.
What comes to mind? Marrow, exactly. Marrow is very mineral rich. And gelatin acts as a hydrophilic substance that pulls liquid to the digestive mass in the stomach. So when you eat a raw food, it has all the enzymes necessary to digest that food already in the food, but when you cook that food, you destroy those enzymes. So by eating the food with bone broth, you sort of make up for the fact that the enzymatic activity is no longer as viable as it would have been if the food were raw, and you use that gelatin to pull digestive enzymes from your body to that digestive mass in your stomach. So that's what they did. And even in Polynesia, where they didn't need to make a fire for warmth, they made a fire every day to make bone broth. So that was another thing they did. Third thing they did was they placed a very high value on organ meats, all of them. They didn't eat the muscle meats of the animal if food was plentiful. So especially in Canada, when he was studying the Native Americans up there, he was surprised because they would make a kill, they'd go right for the organs, and then they'd go for the back fat of the animal. If it was, you know, the right time of year, it would have like a lot of fat on it, and they would eat the fat, and they would eat the organs, and they would leave everything else. Which is just crazy. We can't imagine that. That's what we eat. We eat the muscle meats of animals. They did not, typically. If they needed to eat them because, you know, there wasn't enough food supply, then they would. But typically they would not. They'd go for the organs, the fat, and the bones, where the minerals were. The other thing that they did is with their seeds, and seeds include nuts, grains, beans, and seeds. These are all seeds, okay? Seeds have something called enzyme inhibitors in the outer shell, in the outer hull, and that's to protect the seeds. Seeds aren't like animals. They can't escape if you try to eat them. So they have to have some deterrent to keep them from being eaten prematurely, and also to keep them from sprouting when conditions are not favorable. What makes for favorable conditions for a seed to sprout is warmth, moisture, acidity, slight acidity, and time. So the indigenous cultures that he studied somehow, God only knows how, figured out that in order to make these anti-nutrients, to neutralize them and make them no longer a problem for digestion, they knew that they had to replicate this somehow. So what they would do is they would take their seeds, nuts, beans, and grains and soak, sprout, ferment, and or naturally leaven. Now when we think about naturally leaven, in our Western culture what we think of is sourdough. Sourdough bread is a naturally leavened bread that utilizes these principles of warmth, moisture, acidity, and time. So that was number 4. Number 5 is they favored saturated fat. Now this is a good one because in our modern Western culture, saturated fat is the devil. Saturated fat and cholesterol are what cause heart disease, right? They cause cancer, they lead to diabetes, all these degenerative diseases that we're plagued with. Apparently not. Apparently not. Because these indigenous cultures that Dr. Price studied favored saturated fat. They didn't eat polyunsaturated fats except as they occurred in nature, in nuts and seeds and grains. They didn't go out of their way to extract oils from these food sources and then cook with them. What they cooked with was saturated fat. So how can that be? How can that be? Well, in the 1950s, Ansel Keith came up with the Lipid Hypothesis. The Lipid Hypothesis has held sway all these many years as being the cause of heart disease, specifically in our culture. And what the Lipid Hypothesis states is that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. It's just simple. Saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease. Well, when they were making the studies that led to the Lipid Hypothesis, hydrogenation had already been invented. Does everyone know what hydrogenation is? Does anybody not know what it is?
Wait, do you remove like a double bond or something?
Exactly. So when you're doing hydrogenation, what you're doing is you're taking a polyunsaturated oil and you're trying to saturate it. And without getting too technical about it, basically what that means is you're taking a liquid oil and you're turning it either semi-solid or solid at room temperature. And in order to do that, you have to saturate it with the carbon atoms with hydrogen atoms to make them line up straight, like they would occur in a naturally saturated fat. Well, when you add, as we all know now, everyone's talking about trans fat. Trans fats are the latest thing. Like I said, it took how many years to get to the point where we realized some of this stuff about pastured animals? The same amount of time it's taken us to realize that hydrogenated oils cause heart disease. That's really what's causing the heart disease. It's not saturated fat that occurs naturally in nature. That wouldn't make any sense. It's the saturated fat that's been artificially saturated that causes heart disease. So that was number 5, and what's number 6? I'll think about it and we'll get back to it. So in the meantime, we're going to concentrate on fermentation. Fermentation can be done with animal foods or it can be done with vegetable foods. I wish we had more time, but we're just going to have to kind of rush through this. Today we're going to do sauerkraut because that's something that we're all pretty familiar with in this culture. But the sauerkraut that we buy in the store is typically been pasteurized or heated, and then it can be stored in it's just like canned as opposed to fermented with lactobacteria. So when you ferment something with lactobacteria, you're doing the opposite of canning. Canning is heating up the substance to such a temperature that all bacteria are destroyed. Pathogenic and beneficial bacteria are destroyed, and you're making that food substance sterile. Well, that's not what we're shooting for, because we do not have a sterile gut. Our guts are populated with billions of microflora. Okay, from our mouth all the way to the end is one long digestive tube that's packed full of about 5 to 7 pounds of bacteria. That bacteria in our gut is our immune system. That's what protects us from pathogenic bacteria, viruses, funguses, that type of thing. So we want to multiply these beneficial bacteria in our body. And one